The battlefield rescue. The battlefield was a graveyard of metal and fire. Smoke filled the sky, turning the sun into a dull red circle. Explosions shook the ground, and the air smelled of burnt fuel and blood. Captain Ethan Carter moved carefully between the wreckage, his rifle ready. He was alone. His squad was gone, wiped out in the last attack. Now he was trapped behind enemy lines with no way back. Ethan pressed his back against a broken steel wall, listening. The sound of enemy soldiers was near. Their voices were sharp, their boots crunching against the ground. He held his breath. If they found him, he wouldn't stand a chance. A sudden noise made him turn. It was a weak sound, barely a whisper, someone in pain. Ethan moved slowly, following the noise. Behind a burned-out escape pod, he found something unexpected. A girl. She wasn't human. She was an alien, lying against the wreckage, breathing heavily. Her silver-blue skin was covered in cuts, her dark purple hair tangled. A deep wound on her shoulder dripped dark blood. Her glowing green eyes flickered open, filled with pain and fear. Ethan knew her kind, the enemy. His fingers tightened around his rifle. He should leave her. Maybe even finish her off. That was the rule of war. But then she tried to speak. Help. Her voice was weak, almost lost in the wind. Ethan hesitated. He had seen enough war to know its cruelty. She wasn't holding a weapon. She wasn't wearing armor. She was just a girl, injured, alone, and terrified. Above them, the sky rumbled. Enemy patrol drones were searching the wreckage. If they spotted him, they would call for reinforcements. Ethan had no time to think. With a deep breath, he slung his rifle over his back and crouched beside her. "This is a bad idea," he muttered to himself. He lifted the alien girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. She flinched but didn't resist. She was too weak. Ethan moved quickly, staying low. The drones hummed above, scanning the ruins with red beams. One passed right over them. Ethan held still. The red light hovered for a second, then moved on. Not detected. He let out a slow breath and continued moving. But the danger wasn't over. A distant shout. Footsteps. The enemy soldiers had found the escape pod. It wouldn't take them long to track him. Ethan picked up speed, carrying the girl toward the edge of the battlefield. His boots slipped on the loose dirt, but he kept going. The pain in his muscles burned, but he didn't stop. Then, a gunshot. The ground beside him exploded, sending dust into the air. Sniper. Ethan ducked behind a fallen transport vehicle. His heart pounded. More gunfire followed, bullets hitting the metal with sharp cracks. The enemy knew he was here. He couldn't outrun them like this. The girl stirred in his arms. She tried to speak again. "Why? Help me." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have a reason. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something else. All he knew was that he wasn't letting her die here. The sniper reloaded. Ethan had one chance. He pulled a smoke grenade from his belt and tossed it. A thick gray cloud spread instantly, covering their position. Using the cover, he ran, his legs pushing harder than ever. Shots fired blindly into the smoke, but none hit him. Through the haze, he spotted an abandoned trench ahead. His escape. He leaped into it just as the smoke started to clear. His body hit the ground hard, but he held on to the girl, shielding her from the impact. Silence. Ethan lay still, listening. The enemy was searching, confused by the smoke, but they weren't following him, yet. He had only bought time. The girl in his arms let out a weak breath. Ethan looked down at her. Her glowing green eyes met his. She wasn't just injured, she was scared. And for the first time, Ethan realized something strange. She wasn't just an enemy. She was someone who needed saving. The war had taken everything from both of them. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. Cliffhanger. Footsteps echoed above the trench. The enemy was getting closer. Were they safe? Or was it already too late? Escape to the human base. The trench was cold and damp. The walls were made of broken metal and charred dirt, reminders of past battles. Ethan pressed his back against the edge, listening. The enemy soldiers were close. Their boots crunched on the loose ground above. Their voices were sharp, speaking in their alien tongue, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He adjusted his grip on the alien girl. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Her silver-blue skin was cold to the touch. If he didn't move soon, she wouldn't survive. A sudden noise, a drone hovering overhead. Ethan stiffened. The mechanical eye of the enemy was searching, scanning the battlefield. If it found them, it would send a signal. Then it would all be over. The girl stirred weakly in his arms, her glowing green eyes fluttering open for a brief second. She whispered something, too soft to understand. The drone whirred, its red searchlight sweeping across the trench. Ethan grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it into the air. The dust cloud spread quickly, confusing the drone's sensors for a brief moment. It beeped in frustration, then turned toward the disturbance. That was the opening Ethan needed. With a deep breath, he moved. He carried the girl, crouched low, and slipped through a break in the trench wall. It led to an underground passage, an old escape tunnel built by humans long ago. The smell of damp earth filled the air. The girl coughed softly. Ethan glanced down at her. She was fading fast. "You better not die on me," he muttered, picking up speed. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading away from the battlefield. Ethan knew where it ended, a hidden checkpoint where human forces once had a base. If he was lucky, there might still be a way to call for extraction. But luck wasn't something he had much of these days. A race against time. Ethan's legs ached as he ran. He pushed forward, ignoring the burning in his muscles. The girl's body was too light, too weak. He could feel the heat from her wound against his arm. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small abandoned outpost. The walls were covered in moss, old supplies scattered across the floor. In the center stood a rusty communication panel. Ethan placed the girl down gently. Her breathing was slow, her eyes barely open. "Stay with me," he said, tapping her cheek lightly. She tried to speak again, but no words came out. Ethan turned to the panel, activating it with shaking hands. Static filled the air. "This is Captain Ethan Carter. I have a civilian in need of medical assistance, requesting immediate evac." Silence. Then, a voice crackled through. "Captain Carter, you're alive." Relief washed over Ethan, but he kept his voice steady. "No time for questions. I need an evac now." A pause. Then, "Understood. ETA, 15 minutes. Hold your position." Ethan let out a slow breath. 15 minutes. He just had to keep her alive until then. But fate had other plans. The enemy strikes back. A sudden roar of engines echoed through the air. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew that sound. Enemy patrol craft. They must have tracked his movement. Red lights flared in the distance as two enemy ships circled above. Ethan grabbed his rifle, his mind racing. 15 minutes was too long. The girl let out a weak sound. Her fingers twitched, as if she wanted to grab something but had no strength. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let her die. He checked his ammo. Low. Not enough for a long fight. The first enemy soldiers landed, their weapons drawn. Their glowing eyes locked onto Ethan. One of them pointed at the girl. "She belongs to us," the soldier growled in broken human language. "Give her up." Ethan raised his rifle. Not happening. The soldiers moved in, weapons raised. Ethan's heart pounded. He had to buy time. But how? Then the girl suddenly whispered a word. A single word. Ethan didn't understand the language, but as soon as she spoke, the enemy soldiers froze. They hesitated, their eyes flickering with doubt. Ethan didn't wait to find out why. He fired first. Cliffhanger. A firefight erupts. Bullets fly. The enemy advances, and Ethan fights desperately to protect the alien girl. But the soldiers aren't just here to kill. They want to take her alive. And Ethan doesn't know why. A sudden attack and a desperate flight. Bullets tore through the air, striking the metal walls of the abandoned outpost. Sparks flew as Ethan dived behind a rusted supply crate, his heart pounding. The enemy soldiers moved fast, spreading out, their rifles aimed at him. But they weren't firing to kill. They were moving carefully, too carefully. They wanted the alien girl alive. Ethan stole a glance at her. She was still on the ground, barely conscious, her silver blue skin glistening with sweat. Whatever strength she had left was fading. The enemy leader stepped forward, his deep red armor gleaming under the dim light, his glowing yellow eyes locked onto Ethan. "Human," he said in a rough, accented voice. "You do not understand what you are protecting." Ethan gritted his teeth. "You're right. I don't." He cocked his rifle. "But I do know one thing. You're not getting her." The alien commander let out a low growl. He turned to his soldiers and gave the order. "Take him alive. Kill if necessary." The battle begins. The first soldier lunged, energy blade igniting in his hand. Ethan dodged, rolling across the floor, firing 3 quick shots. The bullet slammed into the soldier's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The second enemy charged, swinging a plasma baton. Ethan barely blocked it with his rifle, the force sending a shock through his arms. He kicked out, knocking the alien back. Then, a sharp pain. A blast grazed his shoulder, burning through his armor. He bit back a curse. The enemy was closing in. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. A desperate plan. Ethan needed an escape, fast. His eyes darted to an old cargo bay door at the far end of the room. Rusted, barely functional, but it led to the outpost's underground hangar. If there was still a ship down there. Ethan made his choice. He fired one last shot, hitting a fuel canister near the enemy. The explosion sent them flying back, giving him the opening he needed. Ethan sprinted toward the cargo bay door, sliding to a stop next to the girl. She was barely breathing. Her glowing green eyes fluttered open for just a second. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're getting out of here." With one final push, Ethan slammed his shoulder against the control panel. The cargo bay doors screeched open. Alarms blared. The ground shook. The enemy roared in frustration, rushing after them. But it was too late. Ethan grabbed the girl and jumped. The fall and the unknown. They fell. The wind roared past Ethan's ears as they plummeted into darkness. For a brief moment, everything was weightless. Then, impact. They landed hard on a pile of old cargo crates, the crash knocking the air from Ethan's lungs. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself up, gasping. The girl let out a weak groan beside him. She was still alive. Ethan looked around, his vision adjusting to the dimly lit hangar. His eyes widened. A ship. It was old, rust-covered, but intact. A small stealth transport, probably abandoned when the outpost was shut down. It was their only chance. Above them, the enemy was regrouping. Voices echoed through the hangar as soldiers rushed toward the stairwell, weapons ready. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scooped up the girl and sprinted toward the ship, slamming his fist against the control panel. The doors hissed open. As he carried her inside, a voice weakly whispered in his ear, "Why are you saving me?" Ethan paused. He looked down at her, the enemy girl, the stranger, the one who was supposed to be nothing more than a casualty of war. But she wasn't. She was something more. And for reasons even he didn't understand yet, he wasn't going to let her die. Ethan exhaled. "Because I can." The final escape. He placed her gently in the co-pilot's seat and rushed to the controls. Dust covered the dashboard, but the system still flickered to life. The ship hummed beneath him. Outside, the enemy opened fire, Bullets and plasma blasts rained against the ship's hull. "Come on, come on," Ethan muttered, hands flying over the controls. The engines roared to life. The ship lurched forward. The hangar doors were still closed. Ethan gritted his teeth and did the only thing he could. He gunned it. The ship shot forward, its reinforced nose slamming into the metal doors. Sparks flew. Metal groaned. Then they burst through. The night sky opened before them. Freedom. Ethan pulled the controls hard, sending the ship soaring into the clouds. The enemy base shrank behind them as warning sirens echoed below. They were safe. For now. Cliffhanger. As Ethan finally exhaled in relief, a sudden beeping filled the cockpit. His heart sank. A tracking signal. The enemy was following them, and this battle was far from over. Stranded together. The cockpit was dimly lit, the soft hum of the ship's failing systems filling the air. Warning lights blinked red across the dashboard. Ethan gritted his teeth, his hands firm on the controls as he tried to stabilize their flight. The enemy signal was still pinging on the radar. They were tracking them, hunting them. The alien girl beside him stirred, letting out a weak groan. Ethan spared her a quick glance. Her silver blue skin was even paler now, her body trembling from the deep wound on her shoulder. She was barely holding on. He clenched his jaw. He had to lose the enemy fast. Nowhere to run. Ethan scanned the ship's limited star maps. They were far from any human-controlled space. His only option was the uncharted moon just ahead. The atmosphere was dense, the terrain unknown. A risky move. But they had no choice. Gritting his teeth, he jerked the controls hard, sending the ship into a nosedive. The girl gasped weakly as the ship shook violently. Outside, plasma blasts from enemy ships streaked past, missing by inches. The pursuit was relentless. Ethan pushed the engines to their limit. The ship tore through the moon's atmosphere, heat flaring around the hull. Metal groaned under the pressure. Then, impact. The ship slammed into the ground, skidding across rocky terrain, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Then, silence. Crash landing. Ethan's vision blurred as he unstrapped himself. Sparks flickered from the broken dashboard. Smoke curled through the cockpit. He turned to the girl. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. "Hey," Ethan said, shaking her lightly. "Stay with me." Her glowing green eyes opened, just for a second. Then she passed out. Ethan cursed under his breath. He didn't even know her name. But that didn't matter right now. Right now, she needed help. Survival begins. Ethan forced the ship's doors open, stepping outside into an alien world. The sky was a deep violet, the air thick with mist. Towering rock formations stretched into the distance. The wind howled through the cracked terrain, carrying strange whispers. It was hostile, isolated, and they were alone. Ethan pulled out his survival pack and weapons. He quickly checked the ship's condition. Bad. The engines were dead, communication systems fried. No way to call for help. They were stuck here. He turned back to the girl. She was too weak to move on her own. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was faint but steady. "All right," he muttered, adjusting his gear. Carrying her again, he started walking. Trust and secrets. Hours passed. Ethan moved carefully through the rocky wasteland, searching for shelter. At last, he found a small cave, hidden between jagged cliffs. He laid the girl down, quickly setting up a small fire. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Ethan exhaled. "You're alive. That's good." She blinked up at him, confusion in her eyes. Her lips parted as she whispered, "You still saving me?" Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, bad habit, I guess." A long pause. She swallowed, looking away. Then softly, "My name is Lyra." Ethan stared at her for a second, then nodded. "Ethan." A moment of silence passed between them. only the crackling fire breaking it. Then she spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "They are not just chasing me." Her glowing eyes met his. "They want me because of what I know." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind, she said, "I know how to end the war." Cliffhanger. Ethan froze. End the war? How? Before he could ask, a low growl echoed from deep inside the cave. They were not alone. The hidden truth and a difficult choice. A deep guttural growl echoed through the cave, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. He instinctively reached for his rifle. The firelight flickered, casting shadows against the jagged cave walls. Lyra tensed, her glowing green eyes wide with fear. Then, movement. From the darkness, a pair of slitted eyes flashed. A hulking shape emerged, covered in dark, armored scales. Its claws scraped against the stone as it moved forward, sniffing the air. It was hunting them. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon. He had little ammo left, and the creature was big, too big to take down easily. He glanced at Lyra. She was still too weak to fight. That meant one thing. They had to run. The escape. Ethan pulled Lyra up, ignoring her sharp gasp of pain. The creature let out a thunderous roar, its massive form charging toward them. No time. Ethan fired 2 quick shots. The bullets bounced off the creature's thick hide. "Of course," he muttered. "Nothing's ever easy." The beast lunged, claws swiping inches from his face. Ethan ducked, grabbed Lyra's hand, and ran. The tunnel twisted and turned, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Behind them, the monster's footsteps thundered, shaking the cavern walls. A sharp turn, then suddenly, the ground beneath them collapsed. Ethan and Lyra plunged into darkness. The underground ruins. Ethan landed hard, pain jolting through his body. A second later, Lyra crashed beside him, coughing weakly. Dust swirled around them. The air was damp, heavy with age. He groaned, sitting up. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the area. They weren't in a cave anymore. They were in ancient ruins. Massive stone structures loomed in the darkness, covered in glowing alien symbols. Strange machinery, long abandoned, hummed faintly with power. Lyra let out a sharp breath. "No, it can't be." Ethan turned to her. "You know this place." She hesitated, then nodded. "It's older than my people. Older than yours." She pressed a trembling hand against the nearest wall. "This is where it all started." Ethan frowned. "Where what started?" Lyra swallowed hard. "The war, a truth long buried." Ethan stiffened. "You said you knew how to end the war. What does this place have to do with it?" Lyra hesitated, then looked at him, really looked at him. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached him, she said, "My people didn't start the war. Neither did yours." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Then who did?" She turned toward the glowing alien symbols, her fingers tracing the ancient carvings. "The ones who came before us. The ones who left all this behind." Ethan exhaled sharply. "You mean another race?" She nodded. "They vanished long ago. But before they left, they engineered the war, shaping our species into enemies. They planted fear, hatred, and conflict into our histories. My people were made to fight yours. And yours were made to fight us." Ethan stared at her. His mind raced. If what she was saying was true, then everything they had been fighting for, everything he had lost, was a lie. A dangerous choice. Ethan clenched his fists. "If this is true, why haven't you told anyone?" Lyra sighed. "I tried." She turned to him, her green eyes filled with sorrow. "That's why they're hunting me. I found the truth, and they'll do anything to silence me." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping the cycle. Lyra swallowed hard. I can prove it. But we have to get off this moon first. Ethan exhaled. He was a soldier. He had fought, killed, and bled for a war that might have been nothing more than a manipulated conflict. Now he had a choice. He could walk away, leave this buried, and save himself. Or he could fight for something greater. He looked at Lyra. The enemy. The girl he had saved. The one person who could change everything. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle. His voice was steady. Then let's make sure they don't silence you. Cliffhanger. As Lyra nods, a distant noise echoes through the ruins. The enemy had tracked them here. Time was running out. A bold proposal. The ancient ruins trembled. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the air, growing stronger with each passing second. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. They weren't alone anymore. Lyra's breathing hitched. She pressed a hand against the glowing alien symbols on the wall, her fingers trembling. They found us, she whispered. Ethan whipped around as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the vast chamber. Shadows stretched along the crumbling walls. The enemy was moving in. Fast. They had only moments before the kill squads arrived. We have to go. Now, Ethan said, grabbing Lyra's arm. She hesitated, her glowing green eyes locked on the mysterious ancient carvings. This place. This is the proof I need. If we leave now, we might never find it again. Ethan swore under his breath. You won't find it if you're dead. Lyra clenched her fists. Frustration, desperation, fear. But she knew he was right. The impossible escape. Ethan pulled her toward the far end of the ruins, where a collapsed archway opened into a narrow tunnel. If they could get out before the enemy cornered them, they still had a shot at survival. The moment they reached the exit, gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets and plasma bolts ripped through the chamber, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. Ethan shoved Lyra ahead. Run. They sprinted into the tunnel, dodging falling debris as the walls shook violently. Then, disaster. A deafening explosion roared behind them as the tunnel collapsed. The force threw Ethan and Lyra forward, sending them sprawling onto a ledge overlooking an underground abyss. Dust filled the air. The sound of enemy soldiers faded. For now, they were safe. But they were trapped. A desperate plan. Ethan pushed himself up, coughing. His ribs ached. His head throbbed. Lyra groaned beside him, struggling to sit up. He checked his gear. Low ammo. No medkits, no backup. Great, he muttered. No way up. No way out. Lyra wiped the dust from her face, looking around. There's another way, she said, pointing toward an old transport lift built into the stone walls. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That thing looks 1,000 years old. Lyra smirked weakly. Then we have something in common. Ethan let out a sharp breath. He liked her attitude. The platform was rusted, its control panel covered in dust. Lyra wiped it clean, pressing a few buttons. The ancient machine rumbled to life, gears grinding against time itself. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to hope. Then, the control panel flickered red. A security override. Lyra's face paled. It needs an authorized genetic signature. Ethan stared at her. You mean yours? She nodded slowly. And there's only one way to do that. The proposal. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. In my culture, genetic access is only granted to those bound by blood. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? She exhaled, then met his gaze. It means, I need to make you my husband. Silence. Ethan blinked. Once, twice. Excuse me. Lyra's expression was serious. A bonding ceremony. It's the only way to link you to my genetic code. Without it, we can't activate the lift, and we're stuck here. Ethan stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You're telling me we have to get married to escape? Lyra didn't blink. Yes. Ethan ran a hand down his face. This was insane. He had faced war, death, impossible odds. But this was new. You're serious. Do I look like I'm joking? Ethan sighed. Fine. How does this work? Lyra hesitated, suddenly looking nervous. It's just a simple ritual, a binding vow. But once we do it, the system will recognize you as my mate. It's permanent. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Permanent? She gave a small, tired smile. Scared, soldier. Ethan huffed. I just met you. This might be the worst first date in history. Lyra smirked. I don't even know what a date is. Ethan chuckled. Against all logic, he actually found her amusing. The moment stretched between them. The sound of distant rubble shifting reminded them. Time was running out. Ethan exhaled and nodded. All right, princess. Let's get married. The bonding ritual. Lyra lifted her hand, palm up. A faint glow pulsed beneath her skin. Repeat after me, she said softly. Ethan hesitated, then placed his palm against hers. The warmth of her skin surprised him. She whispered words in her native language. The air hummed, a strange energy forming between them. Ethan repeated the words, feeling an odd pull in his chest. The markings on Lyra's arm flared with light, and for a brief second, Ethan felt something. A connection. Then the control panel beeped. Access granted. The final twist. Ethan grinned. Well, Mrs. Carter, looks like we're good to go. Lyra rolled her eyes but smiled. I will never call you that. He chuckled, stepping onto the platform as she activated it. The lift lurched upward, carrying them toward freedom. But just as they rose, a new warning flashed on the screen. Ethan's stomach dropped. The system had sent out an alert. To the enemy fleet. They knew exactly where they were. And they were coming. Cliffhanger. As Ethan and Lyra reached the surface, enemy ships descend from the sky. The battle isn't over. It's just beginning. A new beginning and final showdown. The ancient lift rattled as it climbed toward the surface. Dust and loose pebbles tumbled down the shaft. Every few seconds, Ethan checked his rifle, making sure he was ready for what was waiting above. Beside him, Lyra stood silently, her green eyes watching the numbers on the control panel tick upward. Neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say. There was too much to say. Ethan was now bonded to an alien girl he had met barely a day ago. And because of that, the enemy could track them. His grip tightened on his weapon. I hope this marriage comes with a refund policy. Lyra exhaled, half amusement, half exhaustion. It's for life. Ethan smirked, figured as much. Then, a deep tremor shook the lift. They had reached the surface. The enemy arrives. The doors hissed open, revealing the harsh landscape of the alien moon. But the sky wasn't empty anymore. Enemy warships hovered above, their dark silhouettes casting long shadows across the rocky plains. Lyra gasped softly. They're here. Ethan's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a search party anymore. This was an invasion. Dozens of soldiers in red armor descended from the ships, fanning out across the landscape. Gunships hovered like vultures, their cannons glowing with deadly energy. A deep voice echoed through the open comm channels. Surrender the traitor. And the human. Ethan gritted his teeth. No chance. He turned to Lyra. How fast can you run? Lyra smirked. Faster than you, husband. Ethan rolled his eyes. Then start running. The last stand. Ethan pulled Lyra into cover as the first plasma bolts screamed through the air. The ground exploded behind them, sending up a storm of rock and dust. Ethan returned fire, dropping 2 enemy soldiers before ducking behind a jagged cliff. Lyra clutched her side, wincing. The wound from earlier was still slowing her down. Ethan cursed under his breath. They couldn't outrun this. Lyra looked at him, determination in her glowing eyes. We can't just run. We have to end this. Ethan frowned. You got a plan? She hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes, but you're not going to like it. Ethan sighed. Figures. The choice. Lyra pointed toward the largest enemy warship. Their command leader is on that ship. If we take him out, the others will scatter. Ethan narrowed his eyes. How do you know? Lyra exhaled. Because he's my brother. Ethan blinked. What? Lyra continued before he could interrupt. He's been leading this hunt. He's the only one who can call it off. If we can get to him, I can stop this. Ethan ran a hand down his face. You're telling me we have to board an enemy warship, fight through an entire army, and confront your evil space prince of a brother? Lyra bit her lip. Yes. Ethan groaned. Why do I always get the worst missions? The final battle. The moment they made their decision, Ethan grabbed an enemy's fallen rifle and fired a burst toward the closest soldiers. Cover me, he shouted. Lyra nodded, raising her hands. A strange pulse of energy radiated from her palms, knocking 3 soldiers off their feet. Ethan didn't stop to question it. They charged toward the warship. Gunfire lit up the sky. Explosions sent shockwaves through the battlefield. Ethan and Lyra fought through enemy after enemy, moving fast, ruthless, unstoppable. Then, they'd reached the landing ramp. Ethan fired at the control panel, forcing the doors to slam shut behind them. They were inside. The enemy commander's voice boomed through the ship's intercom. You cannot win, sister. Lyra's eyes darkened. We'll see. The confrontation. The command bridge was eerily silent. Lyra's brother stood at the far end, clad in ornate red armor, his golden eyes watching them with a mix of anger and disappointment. You should have stayed dead, Lyra, he said coldly. Lyra squared her shoulders. You should have listened to the truth. Ethan raised his rifle. So, do we talk, or do I start shooting? Her brother smiled. And then the entire ship shook. A countdown appeared on the holographic displays. Self-destruct activated. Ethan's heart dropped. Oh, come on. Lyra's brother smirked. If I die, the secret dies with me. Lyra's hands clenched into fists. No, not today. The final decision. Lyra stepped forward. Call off the hunt. Let humanity and our people choose peace, or we all die here. Her brother studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed. Very well. He pressed a command on his wrist. The countdown stopped. Ethan exhaled in relief. About time. Lyra's brother looked at Ethan. His eyes narrowed. And you, a human. Ethan smirked. Yeah. Surprise wedding. You weren't invited. Lyra's brother rolled his eyes. This will be interesting. Ethan grinned. You have no idea. A new beginning. The war didn't end in a single moment. But this was the first step. Lyra and Ethan stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching as the enemy forces withdrew. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, there was a chance. A chance for something new. Ethan glanced at Lyra. So, guess we're married now. Lyra smirked. Guess so. Ethan chuckled. Well, that's one hell of a honeymoon. Lyra laughed. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years.